Okay. Oh, hold on a second. Good afternoon, folks. Thank you for being here to do it. We are spoiled, we're blessed, we're thankful to have with us two outstanding Mid-Michigan leaders who represent us in this particular area, and students in particular. While you may not be from here all the time, you are right now, and Senator Rick Outman and State Representative Jim Lauer, our state senator and representative, who make sure that we are not only taken care of down in Lansing, but they are certainly doing an awful lot to defend what we see as a great value for you as students to have the opportunity to study. They have been at the front lines of trying to work on your behalf, and I am delighted we have them back on campus today. A nice little tour happened earlier. This is part of our Interfaith series, though, so the questions will mostly be focused around what we know to influence us in making decisions as leaders. And for all of us who are either students, staff, or faculty, we are influenced by something in our background, our faith, our ethos, our philosophy that guides us to do what we do. Today's conversation will kind of weave in and out of that, and you're welcome to ask questions to Senator Outman and Representative Lauer throughout our time here. Grace Hirth, one of our seniors and working in the chapel, is going to do our intro for the two fine gentlemen here, although I'm going to invite them both to come forward if we can offer a nice round of applause. Thank you both. You have these fine outdoor seats right now, so beautiful, absolutely. Thank you, gentlemen. Again, all of this is recorded right now, and we are broadcasting live on YouTube. Because we're limited in the size of our groups that we can have with 25 outside, we're a little bit tighter, but please, there are other people, and the camera is right over there looking at you if you'd like to look at that occasionally. But they will be able to ask some questions, and we will engage for a little while together. Take the time afterwards, folks, though. Get to know your senator and your representative here. Introduce yourself, and I've said this to every student I ever get a chance to, especially when it comes to interacting with our elected officials. They are your elected officials. They love to meet you, hear your stories, and get a chance to see how they can interact with you. So tell them who you are, what you're planning on doing, and let us celebrate all the good that we got here in Mid-Michigan. I'm going to give it over to Grace, and Grace is going to get our questions started. And folks, if you have questions, we'll make sure we pass the mic around afterwards. Grace?
Hello, everybody. Nice to meet you guys. My name is Grace Hirth. I'm a senior here, as Andrew said. I'm a biology pre-veterinary medicine major and a religious studies minor, so hopefully after this I get to go to vet school. Fingers crossed. First, I just want to say thank you. The Michigan tuition grant that you guys fought for so hard for us, that's something that I receive and made coming here a lot easier for me. And it was a big stress relief off my shoulders because there's a time in there where I was very nervous about coming back here again. So I just want to thank you for that. And my question to you is, when in your life, if you had to pick a moment, did your faith really impact what you were doing? I know that's pretty vague, but it could be in your work, in your life in general, but yeah.
So the question was, boy, it'd be hard to pick one particular moment.
Oh,
It's okay.
we thought they were hot mics. Oh, mine is. Yeah.
Okay, I think mine's on now. There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, Rick's, I've always talked to him about making sure they treats every mic like a hot mic. Right, Rick?
I haven't known
Yeah.
to wander.
So I think you were asking about, trying to pick, a particular moment where our faith impacted a decision, and maybe I'll focus it on, when we're in Lansing, working on, a particular piece of legislation or doing something related to that or in the community. And yeah, I think that it's funny, I see this online, there's been a question going around about, does Christianity or does faith, impact, legislation? If the answer is yes, oftentimes it seems like that's been a negative thing. But I'm more than willing to say that it definitely impacts my decision-making. I grew up in a Lutheran household, went to a Lutheran school, K through 5, and then when I became an adult, I actually converted, and I'm now part of the Catholic faith with my wife and I, and we used to go to Catholic Mass right here in Alma before we moved. and all three of our children are baptized, and it's something that's very personal to me, and I think about every day. So it would actually be impossible to have there be an actual separation. I think of when you are voting for, whether it be me or Rick or any candidate, who they are as a person and what's in their background is of course going to be, part of their decision-making process. And even if, you'd like to divorce it from that, it's pretty much impossible to do so, I've found. So I've tried to be upfront about it in the elections, that I am a Christian and that I am very pro-life, and that those values will come into my legislative decision-making. So I try to be honest in that, and people have voted for me anyway, even if maybe they disagreed with some of those things. So I thought that'd be the best way to handle it. But I think, I mentioned pro-life, and I think that'd probably be the most, maybe easiest and most tangible one to bring up. So we've done a lot of legislation over the last 4 years when I've been in office related to that issue, as it surrounds, abortion and those types of things. And, being Catholic, I'm very pro-life. I believe very strongly in that. I've always run as a 100% pro-life candidate, and the voters in this area have always supported that in terms of my election in the primary and in the general election. I've had it on every piece of mail that I put out. So I don't think that they were surprised by that, but, that's something that I think, I take it as a science-based issue, but also as a faith-based issue, the pro-life element of it. So we've done a number of pieces of legislation that some have been vetoed, some have been signed into law related to that.
And as Jim said, it's hard to pick one certain circumstance. If you are a person of faith, it should permeate every aspect of your life at all times of your life. So I would say that going in, many of the decisions, or all the decisions I've made, have had an element of faith and what that means to me involved in the decision-making process. And so, as Jim was talking about as far as pro-life, so when I came in 2010, I came in with the Snyder administration because I was his predecessor. I was the state rep for 6 years here in Montcalm County, and we did multiple pieces of pro-life legislation. We were really labeled as one of the most pro-life legislatures in many years. And so I would say that is a big part of it. But I can think of another particular instance in 2015. So up until that point in 2015, faith-based adoption agencies had been allowed to practice with impunity, and they didn't have any fear of repercussions if they refused to offer adoptions to, let's say, gay or homosexual couples. And it wasn't that they didn't want kids to be adopted out to them. That they didn't think it was right that kids could be adopted out to them. What they said is, it goes against our faith, but we will offer references to people who will make those services available. And so up until that point, that had been the standard practice. What we had said was, let's put that in statute, because they were afraid of impending lawsuits to shut them down. And the reason that DHHS and the state had partnered with these faith-based adoption agencies is because there was such a huge amount of children that needed adoption services that frankly the state couldn't handle them all. So they were great partners with that. And so we actually voted to put that into statute, and that passed during the last administration. But it was controversial. People would say, well, then they shouldn't get paid. Well, they weren't paid for the referrals. Any state money was for the adoptions that they did. So, but recently the Attorney General, Dana Nessel, and the governor have filed a lawsuit to halt that practice. Right now, it's kind of a stay of orders so that they can continue to do it until the decision is rendered. But I guess that's one particular instance where my faith came into play.
We're going to let Grace kind of walk around with the microphone for students who have any questions. We're going to go, and when you ask a question, if you can give your name, your year, maybe what you're studying, or where you think about going next. That'd be great.
Is this? Oh, I love it. Hi. Should I just sort of like speak? Okay. Okay. My name is Micah Schultz. I'm a junior here at Alma, and I'm studying environmental science and biology. It's a little bit about me. My question is for you guys. To what extent is it necessary / possible to politically separate your faith from the political system, if it's possible, or like when do you deem it necessary to do that, I guess?
Well, you want me to start?
Yeah, because I'm not sure what that question means.
Yeah, can you maybe help us understand the question a little bit better? I'm happy to answer it. I'm just not 100% clear on what you're asking.
Let me put it into like different words. Putting into context that you represent such a large variety of people that not everyone believes the same as you, are there certain circumstances where you may have to separate what you believe for representing everyone instead of just those who believe the same as you in your faith and whatnot?
Sure. No, I really appreciate that. That was, I understand what you're getting at now 100%. So most of the time it doesn't come into bearing on any particular piece of legislation. There's the examples that Rick and I were just talking about where there is a faith component to it. But most of the time you try to represent the community as a whole, and there isn't necessarily a religious element to most pieces of legislation. Now, can you divorce, like I mentioned in my intro, completely who I am as a person? No, you can't, but it doesn't necessarily come into fruition on every single piece of legislation. There's just something that I couldn't vote for would be, something that goes against my pro-life principle, but the way to kind of mitigate that is, as I'd mentioned, I was very upfront about that when I was running, that's who I am and how I intended to legislate. But there's very few examples of that where there's something that maybe is that overt, because obviously the Constitution wouldn't allow for an establishment of any kind of religion or even putting maybe a Catholic flavor on a piece of legislation. I wouldn't intend to do that, and I don't think that would necessarily be good for the public or even that church in that case, because it would be very controversial and probably not appropriate. So I would say it doesn't necessarily come down to individual day-to-day bills that often, but there are the cases where it does that we talked about in the prior question.
And I would agree to that. I can remember, so I ran in 2008 and lost miserably. Came away fourth, I think.
Fifth.
Fifth? Not in a five-way, in a six-way. But it kind of opened my eyes to politics. I was asked to run at that time, and didn't come from a political family. I mean, the only race we ever watched every year was the drain commissioner's race because we were excavators, and that mattered to our pocketbook. But in the meantime, I had developed a friendship with Judy Emmons, who was the former state representative, my predecessor, and then also my predecessor in the Senate. And so she was our senator, a couple years ago. And I can remember seeing her at an event, and I said to her, "How do you do it?" As I started investigating more about this political process, how do you go down there every day and struggle to find the right answers, struggle to compromise with those within your own party or those of the other party to craft meaningful legislation? And probably the best piece of advice I got from her, and I got a lot of advice from her, and it was all good, but probably the best was know what your values are before you go down there, and draw those lines in the sand before you ever get down there, so that you don't have to make the decision on the fly. You know where your line in the sand is. That doesn't mean you can't toe the mark, but just don't cross it. And so as I work through legislation, I try to keep that in mind. I know where my line in the sand is morally. But I also know that every piece of legislation isn't going to be what I agree with 100%. Matter of fact, I would say 0% of the time is it going to be 100% of what I believe, or at least a small amount. But what I do know is probably the most meaningful legislation that's crafted happens when it's compromised. And so, as I look at legislation, I say, okay, where's my mark? What's the line I won't cross? And then I look at it and I say, now, does this move the ball down the field in the direction that I want it to go? I don't have to have a touchdown with every pass. I'm willing to have a ground game that inches it down there. And so that's what I'm looking for when I look at legislation. And as far as maybe alienating myself from certain segments of my constituency, that's probably going to happen. But as a rule, you try to represent everyone. And again, as they went through, just as Jim was saying, as they go through my literature and decide who they're going to vote for, I certainly make it abundantly clear what my values are, because I think that's most important. Not necessarily my educational background, although that's important, but certainly what my values are, because that's going to dictate a lot of what I do.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Hello?
Oh, there it goes.
Okay. Hi, my name is Elizabeth Radeville. I'm a first-year student here at Alma, and I'm currently hoping to study education. I am curious how you respond as people of faith to people that say that Christians should not be involved in politics because, when Jesus was here on earth, he wasn't necessarily coming to overthrow the political system or be a part of that. And how do you respond to people that say that Christians should be, above politics or outside of politics or not get involved?
You want me to start?
Go ahead.
I obviously don't agree with that that perspective because it's hard to change society or move it in a direction that you'd want to by not being a participant in it. I don't know why when you were asking the question, it reminded me of an instance. I guess I'll just share the story. When I was running for Congress last year, and I was in front of a group of people that, frankly, there were a number of people there that were very anti-Muslim for whatever reason, and they wanted there to be. They said if I was elected, would I do a bill that made it to where Muslims couldn't run for United States Congress? And I kind of laughed. I was surprised it was a serious question, but they were serious. And I said absolutely not. And I knew it wasn't what they wanted to hear, but I remembered back to when John Kennedy was running in 1960. One of the big issues in the campaign early on was actually the fact that he was Catholic, and there'd been no Catholic ever elected to the presidency. And they tried to, in both overt and subversive ways, try to turn that into an issue and say things like, oh, well, he'd be loyal to the Pope as opposed to the American people, and a lot of very bigoted views, frankly, just as bigoted as this question of Muslims not being able to run for Congress. So what someone's faith is, I don't think is should be a determining factor in whether they are or aren't going to be involved in politics. But I think that it makes up who a person is, as we've talked about in a couple of the different questions, and it's something to be aware of. But to go directly to your question, I don't think that you have to be like outside of it. There's no way to escape politics in this day and age, as sad or as good as that might be. I mean, you look at it, everything's political, even everything going on with the pandemic and how it's being handled, how I conduct myself, how Rick does, how we do or don't do things, even that's politicized. So there's really no escaping, there's just no escaping politics anymore. So I think a bad thing to do would be, if you look at, in our district, there's a lot of, not Mennonites, help me out here, Amish, and they don't participate in politics at all. They don't vote for kind of some of the reasons that you've expressed. And I think that's unfortunate, like at least from Rick and I's perspective, because they tend to be more conservative voters. So we're like, oh, if they'd vote, then it would certainly help our case out, right? But having said that, they don't get to a seat at the table either, right? Like that would be a huge constituency if they would vote, and they would try to have some of their worldview represented in that political and democratic process. So I think to disengage from it would be a bad thing, because then you're guaranteeing that you're not going to be taken into consideration. Like if a bill's being considered, a piece of legislation, people do think about how it impacts different groups, whether they be religious or whether they be minority groups or women's groups or just business groups, you name it. There seems to be a categorization going on. Everyone wants to split everyone into these different groups, which I actually don't like. I think that that's bad. I think we should focus more on us all being Americans or all, citizens of the state of Michigan. But you do see that going on, and if you're not part of the discussion, you're not engaged in that political process, then you will be discounted, and they'll move on to the other people who are engaged in it.
That's true, particularly when he speaks about the Amish. Now, I happen to do a lot for the Amish and their issues just because prior to my role as being a legislator, I was an excavator, and I still do that part-time, but I've done a lot of work for the Amish over the years. I grew up surrounded by Amish, and so they actually do turn to me, but I've said to them over and over again, it really is incumbent upon you guys to figure out a way to at least vote on at least local stuff, if not at the state level, because there are a lot of rules that get implemented that I can remember one they were really pushing, that all Amish houses had to be wired. They didn't have to have the switches in it and everything, but the rationale behind it was eventually that house may be sold to an Englishman and they're going to need electricity, and it's a lot easier to wire a house during construction than it is after the fact. And I mean, there's some validity to that, but then let's extrapolate that. I like having fireplaces in my house, and there may be a chance I buy that house sometime down the road, so I'm going to demand that every house have a fireplace too, even if you're never going to use it. I mean, that's how ridiculous it sounded to me. Because they don't vote, there are a lot of rules that get put into place because there's no bad effects from it. I mean, they're not held. It's about like being a bureaucrat as opposed to an elected official. If you're part of, let's say, Eagle, which was formerly DEQ, you're not accountable to the elected people. You're accountable to your job and to your higher-ups. And so you lose that element of wanting to satisfy your constituency, to respond to them. And so, you're right. I mean, and as far as, Jesus not being in office, being political, well, he certainly was political, I would say. And he certainly will be the high king. But a lot of kings were put in place. Well, matter of fact, the Bible says that everybody who's in elected office or in power, not necessarily even elected, is put there by God, be good or bad. I mean, you can look at the case of Nebuchadnezzar, who you would say was probably not a Christian, but he certainly was put there by God's hand. And if people of faith don't participate in the political process, particularly by running for office, then there's no way for them to craft legislation that's favorable to what we believe is right. So I think it's incumbent upon us as people of faith that we actually do participate.
Other questions? I've got one to throw in a... What's that? I'll be loud. You'll pick me up with the mic. So I'm guessing, I'm going to put words in your mouth, but did you plan on doing this between the ages of 18 and 22? Did you think you'd be elected to state office like this? And if not, what sort of led you in that direction? But I'm using that question as a tie-in to everyone else. What recommendation or advice would you give to everyone else about finding their path or their call based on your own experiences?
So, I got involved in politics fairly young, actually. I volunteered for a few campaigns, and I ran for Ionia County Commissioner when I was 20 and was elected. So I guess whether or not I knew it would turn into something where I ended up running for state rep, I was working for the State House as a staff member at the time, so certainly the thought had crossed my mind. Although the interesting thing is when the seat, I'll wait for that.
That we're 3 minutes before the hour. It's this cursed bell tower that's
just a little off. Maybe you can hear me over it, but I was starting to lose my train of thought because of the bells. I apologize, but so it had crossed my mind. Although ironically, when Rick was termed out of office, because we have term limits in the state of Michigan, I had actually, and he and I had talked about it, I had decided not to run just because, you know, I was city manager for Edmore at the time, and my wife and I were getting married, and it was something that I'd always, you know, maybe wanted to do down the road, but wasn't sure if the timing was right.
And I begged him.
And Rick's like, well, you really need to run, you'd be great, and this kind of thing. And my wife and I had talked about it, and I felt called to do it, but at the same time, I felt called to not do it, which I know sounds counterintuitive. But ultimately, I felt like, you know, the district, I could add a lot of value, and, you know, Rick certainly really encouraged me to run. We looked at some of the other candidates that were running, and a number of people in the community were like, you'd be good at this, you've got a lot of experience even at a young age, and I ended up doing it, and I'm glad I did. You know, it's funny, that decision to run, I've always never looked back and regretted, you know, something that I was a little outside of my comfort zone on, or maybe it wasn't the right time. Like even when we decided to have kids, you know, is there ever really a good time to do that? You know, we have 3 under 3 right now, so maybe I looked at it at the same thing. Maybe it wasn't the perfect time, but it's public service, something I've always enjoyed, and I'm glad we did it at the time. And there was a second part to the question.
Yeah, how would you tell someone else between 18 and 22 what they're supposed to, how they figure out what they're called to do at the right time? How do you decide to listen to other people or to God's call?
I was going to say, we've talked a lot about faith in this, and I know that's I really did feel at the end of the day when the final decision was made, and I know Rick has a story to tell it's you know, in this same vein, because, you know, I've talked about it a lot, actually. I felt very at peace with it, and that I was, you know, sometimes you just feel like you're exactly where you're supposed to be. And then I'd mentioned I was running for Congress last year and ended up not running. I ended up getting out of the race in November, and I felt very good about that, and I still feel really good about that because we had another child on the way, and we have little kids at home, and if I were to be successful, you know, you'd be going back and forth to DC and all of the stuff. When we decided to get in, I don't know that we'd fully contemplated all of that, but it's interesting how many positive things have come out of it for our life, even though I didn't end up going through with it. You know, we made a lot of changes in our life preparing for that campaign that have been good changes. So I guess my advice is you never know where it's going to lead, even if you don't, let's say you don't win the election or it doesn't end up being where you wanted to go. Trying something like that, for me, has been very beneficial. I've been less risk averse than a lot of people. I think that Rick would probably agree with that. I'm not a daredevil by any means, but I'm definitely a risk taker, but a calculated risk taker, I guess you'd say. And I've never looked back and been like, wow, I wish I wouldn't have, you know, taken that risk.
Oh, that's great. And congratulations on the 3 under 3. That's
Yeah. And the older one is potty trained now, so that's been a big deal.
And he called me the other night to let me know.
My son did. He
Yeah.
wanted to talk to Rick and let him know.
James did.
He was that excited about it.
Because he rides my excavators and my dozers.
He's into all that stuff. Yeah.
He calls me Grandpa Backhoe.
Grandpa backhoe?
Grandpa Backhoe.
I like that.
Isn't that cute?
So, for me, I guess the path is a little different. It seems like between the ages of 18 and 22, I was deciding the things that I never wanted to do as opposed to the things that I did want to do. So when I was a senior in high school, what I did say is, I'm never going into excavating. I avoided that like the plague growing up. And I'm not going to college because I'm tired of school. So in my senior year of high school, in the spring of that year, I joined the military unbeknownst to my parents until I got home from the AFI station in Detroit on my mom's birthday and said, guess what? I'm in the Army. And there wasn't a laugh behind that one. And but I went in, and I expected to make that my career. But a funny little thing happened to me on the way to Detroit. I had never left home before, and immediately I was homesick. And so during that entire time in the military, even though I had a lot of fun, I got to see a lot of the world that I wanted to see. I got to see a lot of the world that I'll never want to see again. There was always that melancholy. I want to be home. We have a pretty close-knit family, and I just wanted to be home. And so when it was over and I got out, my sister was going to Grand Valley at the time. She was a year younger than me, but we were really close because we were only a year apart. And so I saved up all my leave time so that I could get out in time to enter college. And she had me all signed up, and I went to college for biology and be a biology teacher. And so the person that was never going to go to school anymore all of a sudden was in college to go to school for the rest of his life to be a teacher. And then we had a tragedy in my family. I had a brother that was killed, and our excavating business was a 2-band show, and my dad needed me. So once again, the thing that I avoided like the plague growing up, I now own. And so those were the things I said that I would never do. As far as politics, it was never even a thought. I mean, I didn't say I was going to. I didn't say I wasn't going to. It didn't exist for me. When our drain commissioner that spring in '08 asked me to run for office, she was the vice chair of our Republican Party, and which I didn't even know we had a Republican Party. And she's telling me about Judy Emmons, who had just termed out, and blah, blah, blah. We're looking for somebody to run. And I'm just giving her a blank stare, and her words verbatim were, "I'm talking about you, you idiot." And I laughed. And I said, "Sandy, here's what I can tell you. I wouldn't even vote for me, so I don't know who you think would." And she said, "You'd be surprised." She kept working on me all spring. Finally, I said, "All right, throw my hat in the ring. If it draws any fire, you call me." I figured that'd be the end of it. I get a call the next day. Dave Camp was our congressman at the time, before John Molinar. His office wanted to meet with me anytime, anywhere, as quick as I could. Not because they saw me as a rising star or anything. They were vetting all candidates. I went to that meeting, came home, and I will say, in between that time and the time Sandy had initially asked me, there was something in me. It was divinely inspired, I'm sure. I don't know how to describe it, but I couldn't get it out of my mind, this thought of running for office, even though I didn't even know what that meant. I didn't know what a state rep was. And so when I met with his office, they finally convinced me to sign on the dotted line. So I got home that day, and my wife happened to be home at the time. And she doesn't usually see me home during the middle of the day, particularly in clean clothes, because I'm an excavator by trade. And she said, "Well, what are you doing home?" And I told her the whole story, because I hadn't even run it by her. I said, "Look, the reason I didn't tell you about it is because it was a non-issue. I wasn't going to do it." And I can tell you at that time, we were, religion was never a part of her life growing up. And the words from her were, "Maybe this is God's plan for you," really took me back, because I would have never expected to hear that from her. And to me, a little bit more confirmation, because I kept saying to God, "Is this what you want me to do?" And I could feel, I felt his prodding. But like I said, I lost terribly. I mean, I can remember the day of the election when it was over. I didn't have a lot invested in it because I didn't even know how to run a campaign. And when it was over, I just thought, well, maybe I didn't hear you right. And I said something to the effect of, "Well, God, if you're going to ask me to do something in the future, can you hit me upside the head with a 2x4 to really get my attention? Because maybe I didn't catch this one right." And then I thought, okay, it's over. I'm going on with my life. Well, in the meantime, we had an incumbent. He was a Democrat that got elected that year. And 2 years later, Judy Emmons called me, asked me to run again. This time I really didn't feel God's prompting. So I was really hesitant to do it. But things just kind of moved along in that direction. I mean, my brother-in-law, my sister, and myself, we had prayed multiple times about it. And actually, when I decided to do it, I shouldn't say I decided to do it. I wasn't going to. Judy and I are arguing about it. She said, "Just go sign up. And if you had to do it by Tuesday of that year, and if you don't want to do it by Friday, you can pull your name off. You won't be on the ballot. But it'll give us a few more days to argue about it." So I did that, but by Thursday night, we as a family had decided I'm out. And I'm on a job that just things kept going longer and longer and longer. And I'm trying to break away because I'm assuming I've got to go down to the Secretary of State's office in Lansing to withdraw my name. That's how you put your name on. And just got so late. And my brother had gotten a call from a former county commissioner that it had convinced him all of a sudden that, well, let's go for it. So, long story short, I stayed in and I got elected. Again, I didn't feel God's prompting in this one, but it seems like doors opened that previously had been closed to me in 08. So what I can say is, I think in 08, that was God's plan for me. It just wasn't his time for me. But it was certainly his time for me to get my name out there so that people knew me the next time. Because then everything has seemed to fall into place since then. And I got to come in with a new Republican administration and all these things. And so as far as my advice to 18 to 22-year-olds, certainly be in prayer. I think that's the most important thing. Listen for God's promptings, and talk to people who matter to you. Make sure you go into it for the right reasons, because you get the right job, the job that's fulfilling, the job that you're meant to have. It's not going to feel like a job.
Well, part of that, and as we continue, I would say students have to get to work and to the classes, but take the time. You have your state senator, your state representative here. I'm putting you on the spot a little bit. I'm sure you'd be willing to talk to students to get to know a little bit of their stories. But
Absolutely.
Great.
what we've been wrestling with as a semester two, what is God calling you to be, and what is God calling you to do? And those two things relate to one another. But first, it's who are you, and now what do you do now that you know who you are? And I think you can share some of the stories, get to know each other, and also both of you have access to your elected officials. They're wonderful. They're fine men for coming here and talk with us a little bit. And please give them a round of applause. Thanks for doing this today, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
And I would say if you want to go talk to them right now, that'd be outstanding. But if you can't, leave information. I'm sure we can make sure you get in touch. But also go down to Lansing when it's allowed to, and we can do it. It's nice having.
You want him back?
Absolutely. Once we're allowed to do a little bit larger groups, I want you to come back and actually do our interfaith services too. It'd be awesome. But thank you all. And everybody else, thanks for taking the time. But get a chance to